Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, RationalStandard.com, and of course, Champion Books, which does have the inaugural book out, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World. I plugged this pretty much every episode so far since it's been out, and like I mentioned on the last episode, if you haven't gotten a copy, really you're robbing yourself more than you're doing anything else there. It's definitely a great read for either entry-level people into libertarianism or even people who are a little more advanced. Follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow myself directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the episode. Today, I'm actually joined by Adam Barsouk. Adam, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Killian. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. And I did do that deliberately, yeah.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Adam here is actually, he's a medical student and cancer researcher. He also works with me in the Being Libertarian family of editors here. He's actually the lead editor for Champion Books. And he was also a contributor for it. So he's the writer there, and he also did a lot of the work in the background that actually made that publication happen after all of the works were submitted by all the different authors that were involved. The reason I have Adam on today is because we're going to be discussing Ayn Rand. I always feel like I say the name wrong, even if I know I said it right. I don't know why.
Well, I think it's not a real name. She came up with that because her Russian name must have been too difficult for the folks here to pronounce. That's why it's hard to. Alisa Zinvoyevna Rosenbaum. Ayn Rand has a shorter ring to it, huh?
Yeah, I don't feel bad about saying the name now. So, like I said, I got Adam on here to discuss her works, her life, some of her contributions to liberty movement, some of the things where she drew lines and was a little bit different from libertarians, because a lot of people, as they know, she had her stances that put her a little out and away from the rest of the libertarian movement. She wasn't necessarily a fan, but I'm sure we'll get through all that. Of course, the episode. To start it off here, Adam, let's go to her most well-known work, which of course would be Atlas Shrugged. So, in the book Atlas Shrugged, it was a lot of philosophy, but it was framed in the form of it was framed less like a normal less normal political book, and more in the sense of just, a fiction, a story that was presenting these ideas. What would you say are some of the most important or impactful ideas that came out of that work?
That's absolutely correct, Killian. She, her foundation was as a fictional writer. She wrote plays for Broadway first. So she had a different approach to philosophy, and she really integrated lessons into stories as opposed to just present them overtly. Atlas Shrugged and then Fountainhead, her two most popular works, were some of her last. They were long. Anyone who's tried to get through either of them knows that it's hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of pages to go through. But you really never lose, even though it's a narrative. You have these very long soliloquies and monologues that break down her philosophy. So you get both a story to follow, and she does present her ideas fairly overtly in that sense. Those ideas, I think, well, you mentioned that she takes a very different road from a lot of the philosophers that you've discussed previously on this program. In fact, she kind of dismisses most of philosophy that came before her, saying it's just men fantasizing, coming up with rules and ideas that don't exist in nature. And so what she really set out to do was to bridge philosophy and science to come up with a framework where the rules are based on what is in nature, right? She called it objectivism. The idea that the world is in fact what it is, right? It doesn't matter whether you look at it from this perspective or that perspective. It's not relative. There is absolute fact, truth in the world, which is science. And it is the human's rational purpose to understand that and to adapt to it and to make the most of it and build off of it. That and in that sense, just postulating and coming up with with ideas and rules and morals that don't exist in nature is nonsense. We have to take the world for what it is and respond to it, as opposed to try and like come up with a world or a moral code of our own.
Now, going off of that, comparing it to, well, even though she said to or tried to dismiss a lot that came before, comparing it to a previous philosopher from before her, some of her works, it's very reminiscent of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperatives, where, like you said, there's things that are, you can have hard facts and objective facts, and that's the thing that you need to work from. But she also tried to apply this to morality. Now, you see a lot of different argumentation around morality, talking about it as a social construct, stating that, this is something that people came up with based on how they feel. So if it's something people came up with, then that makes it subjective inherently. What was Rand's primary argument against that line of thinking?
So you're absolutely correct that Rand did see morality as a social construct. It's something, in some sense, it's something that humanity comes up with, but it's also, it can be an adaptive social construct, right? I think that's where Rand was really the forebearer of a big movement that we see today, where people try and use principles such as like evolutionary biology, psychology, and apply those to philosophy and politics. People like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, so forth, where they say that, yes, these morals may not have existed, in the world before humans came, but that doesn't mean that they're all equal. There's a reason why slavery, why murder, why those things are inherently bad, and that is because they are maladaptive for humanity. They're not just bad because someone decided one day they were bad. They're bad because they bring us all back. They deprive humans of the optimal conditions that allow our species to progress, to thrive, to accomplish. And that's where Rand was going from. She was saying that morality has to be looked at as any other evolutionary adaptation, as something that makes man unique. That's something that allows man to rise above our pitiful origins and really create the innovations that we've seen in the world around us.
And there's a lot to be said for that argument, of course. I mean, we can go through tons and tons of philosophers as far as the back and forth and some of the evolutions on that. One that I like to bring up, and I always try to bring up controversies or different things like that I know of when it comes to certain philosophers. And I mean, she had a fair amount of them that she worked through because of how hardline she was on a lot of her stances. The one, though, that a lot of people use against her that I'd like to mention, hear your thoughts on, I've got my own as well, but she was always very much against the concept of a welfare state. She was very much against the idea of forcibly taking from people what is rightfully theirs in order to take care of other people, whether they live or die, whether there's, regardless of the situation that other person is in, it is morally wrong to forcibly take from people. And this is something that even people that take a softer approach when it comes to libertarian ideology, like a Nozick or one of those types, even those people still work off of that same kind of viewpoint. They just don't necessarily go into it as hardline as she did. Bringing it to the controversy, though, towards the end of her life, she, of course, ended up having to take advantage of systems like that because of the overall state of her health and everything else is that when it was in the decline in her final years. So would you consider that to be a form of hypocrisy, or is there anything in her works or in her philosophy or mindset that would validate that decision?
That's a very interesting point that I actually hadn't heard brought up before. I'll tell you, first off, I think the reason that Rand comes off as so perhaps hardline, as you put it, is because, once again, she operated from this mindset of the origin of humanity is this tough African bird, right? Where you either eat or get eaten. That is the baseline for humanity. And how far we've come today, where we have our creature comforts, right? Where we have homes, we're protected from animals, we have all this innovation, is because each person was pursuing his or her own self-interest. That's what allowed us to improve our situation so drastically. And that's why that ultimately one's right, the one doesn't have a right, even to be protected from starvation or from anything like it, from disease in her mindset, because that is the baseline of humanity: starvation, disease, despair. And everything that we've worked towards to get further than that happened because somebody was pursuing their own interest, not because someone was pursuing a social good. Now, you bring up an interesting point that she did, in fact, benefit off of social welfare programs in her later years. You could certainly make an argument that, when you're fighting a hopeless battle and everyone around you is dismissing your points, at some point, perhaps you give in and say, I'm going to do what everyone else does, right? If everyone around me is enjoying the social security benefits and free healthcare, and no one's listening to the points I have to bring up, why should I be the sole? Why should I punish myself and act against my self-interest if it's not going to make a difference in the grand scheme of things? I guess that's a more utilitarian approach. But yeah, looking with hindsight at it, I could see it as hypocritical. I would agree with people who hold that perspective. I think if you're truly, if it were possible, as Rand postulates in her Atlas Shrugged, for high achieving people to just leave society and start their own little utopia of their own, then I would expect, someone who claims to be high achieving to get on the bandwagon, to leave to that utopia and reject all social help and work for themselves. But since we live in a world where that isn't possible, you can't escape U.S. taxes. You can't escape the overbearing burden of the U.S. or Canadian or whatever government you live under, really. That's not a viable alternative. We're forced to deal with what we have.
Mm-hmm. One thing I find interesting, though, and this is something I've actually heard in her defense for that, we've heard about her objective thought, like her thoughts as far as objectivism is concerned. You kind of touched on it there as far as people serving self-interest. I refer to this, I've seen this referred to as Rand's approach to basically her own version of egoism, where it's very, like you mentioned, self-interested, self-driven, in which case I kind of don't see it as hypocritical as often as it gets brought up. I don't necessarily see it as hypocritical, her taking advantage of what's available to her, even though she disagrees with its existence. So long as it's there, of course she would take advantage of it because that fits that self-serving or that self-interest concept almost to a T.
Well, I don't know if... See, it's interesting. People often misinterpret Rand's egoism and her apathy towards altruism. That they paint it as, Rand is selfish and she's advocating for exploiting everyone around you just to serve your self-interest. She did explicitly in many places speak out against what she called predation. You're supposed to pursue your self-interest as long as you're not stepping on someone else's toes. You're not infringing on someone else's rights. Because that is, she wasn't for pure anarchy, where you kill your neighbor to steal their crap, You are pursuing your self-interest within a framework that everything that you have created is in fact yours, that there are property rights, that there is a pursuit of happiness and a right to life and liberty, those sort of negative rights. So in that sense, I guess it wouldn't be fair of her to benefit from the welfare system if she truly believes that's immoral and that's depriving taxpayers of their God-given right, or not, whatever, of their unalienable right, however you want to put it. Evolution given in Rand's
I'm
terms.
not a big fan of semantics. I get what you meant.
Sure.
Speaking though, when we talk about some of the different ideologies that are there, one thing I did want to talk about, because this is something that I've always really appreciated with Rand, even though it doesn't come up that often, and that was her work on the idea of the mind-body split. So for anyone that's listening that's unfamiliar with the concept, it's what divides rationalists from empiricists. The original divide was whether or not, it took the concept of there being a mind, everything being driven by the brain, by rationale, by the brain coming up with its interpretations, what it's sensing, everything else like that. And on the flip side of that, you had the empiricists that based everything on physical evidence, physical interactions with the world, et cetera, saying that sometimes your brain or your perception of these things could be incorrect. So we have to work off of the physical and the actual. What I like with Rand is that she took an attempt to actually solve that divide. I mentioned Immanuel Kant earlier. He attempted to fix that divide, but with the difference of his two imperatives, I think that the impact of that work really just led to the divide being even larger than it was previously with the onset of empiricists and rationalists. But she came up with the idea of similar with, it's inside of her objectivism as well. I think she spoke about this more in The Fountainhead than Atlas Shrugged, where she talks about the importance of reasoning through the world, but you have to do so based on a lot of the empirical evidence that's presented to you and be able to divide between what is real and what is being generated by the mind. It's ultimately the mind that has to be able to make the decisions and stay sharp and deal with all these things. But you still have to base that on what is real rather than some of the ideas that the mind creates what it observes and different, more out there ideas when it comes to rationalism and empiricism.
Sure.
So I really liked her work or her attempt at fixing that because she was one of the few philosophers that actually tried. Most either just took one side or the other and just tried to deepen the divide in their favor. But like you mentioned earlier, she really came out of left field with a lot of this stuff where I shouldn't say left field with her, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where she really tried to answer questions as if she knew these questions existed, but not trying to do it from the perspective of echoing all of the people that came before and just having, just doing a quote fight between a whole bunch of people that lived hundreds of years before her.
Absolutely. So she certainly started from scratch with a lot of these issues, almost so. But in some ways she was right. She was a product of her time. It was no longer like the era of the philosophers, right? We were being introduced into the era of science. You have mass weapons in World War I, or chemical weapons. You have the origins of atomic nuclear energy, so forth. So it was a different world where she was coming into prominence, where no longer you could just use flimsy rules and religious doctrines to back up your work. And I think that's where, as you mentioned, first off, her rationalism really took off in a sense, because as you were saying, that whole idea is that because the world is how it is, because it's objective, because there are maxims and laws and axioms, right? There's gravity, there's the fact that if you don't hunt, that you won't eat. Because all those things exist, it is what makes a human that they use their rational mind to comprehend the world and adapt to it, right? Instead of trying to stick your head into the sand like an ostrich and say, I want the world to be kinder. I don't accept it for what it is. It is the core tenet of human rationalism that we see the world as a difficult and vicious place, and we apply our intellectual capacities towards solving the world's scarcities and issues how we can. Now, on the other hand, you mentioned that Rand did do a lot on what I believe she called like the soul-mind dichotomy, soul-body dichotomy, something like that, where she tries to she's certainly a kind of left brain, very as we said, pro-rational thinking figure and thinker, but she also admits, right, that she sees the soul as like the body of action, right? You have to be a thinker and a person of action. You in fact indulge your soul. You deal with the emotional and psychological issues of being human by employing your mind to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish, by innovating, by succeeding, by being of value to others. That is how you both stimulate the mind and feed your soul in the sense. So in that way, she connected the two. She bridged the two, as you said.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of the things that you can come out of the philosophy and say, this is very positive. This is something that's 100% you're in agreement with, or you get the idea, you're 100% on board. For you personally, though, what would you say, if anything, in her works or in her general philosophy, what's something that you find yourself disagreeing with, or at least not being 100% on board with?
That's a great question, Killian. I'm not quite. I don't think that her very rigid stance against all forms of religion and against kind of community and altruism, they're somewhat contradictory to her other ideas, and they're not helpful to making her case. And I think to kind of break that apart, I want to give a little bit of background and detail, because just like Rand, my family were indeed Soviet Jewish escapees. Right, so they were victims of the Soviet Union. Rand left in 1926. Right, my parents left when it was collapsing 60 years later. But they were raised by the same very ultra atheist, anti-religious system. They were persecuted for being Jewish, not even for believing in any Jewish religion or something like that. Simply, Jews were seen as an inferior racial, ethnic minority there, and persecuted for it. And I think in some ways that left its mark, that left a scar on her thinking that she never fully shook. She dismisses religion entirely, saying that it doesn't fit in with rationalism. Right? It is the opposite of people using their minds to understand the world around them, because they come up with stories or ideas, gods that don't exist altogether. Hence, it's useless. But I think in a sense, right, religion is, some people at least would argue, who build off of her work, right? People like Jordan Peterson, who cite her quite a bit, would argue that it's quite the opposite. Religion was used throughout history as a way of understanding the world around you, as a way of adapting to it, as a way of spreading these adaptive morals, like, say, the Protestant work ethic, like hard work leads to success. And in that way, by completely throwing out religion, she like throws out the baby with the bathwater, right? She dismisses the good and the bad of ideas like religion, of feelings like community, when in fact these can promote human advancement, success, innovation in many circumstances, as they have throughout history.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. One thing that comes up with a lot of the philosophers that we've discussed on various episodes throughout the series that we've been doing on these thinkers so far has been that some of the thinking that they have is very tied to the kind of times that it came from, the kind of places the ideas originated from. I mean, you can see this with the difference in the evolution between even broad scale Eastern versus Western philosophy as a whole. You can kind of see the influence of location on the minds of some of these great thinkers. When we're talking about that, though, if we're saying, these ideas are very, not all of them, of course, because some of them are just her rationale applied, but how would you say her ideas hold up over time?
Well, we're all, as you said, a victim of our context, of our small place in history. But I think that's where Rand kind of made a step forward from everyone behind her, in that by wholeheartedly embracing objectivism and rationalism, she creates a metric by which we can judge philosophies and morals irrespective of what time period they come from. Right, because we're using the metric of, is this adaptive to human progress? Right, does this bring man forward, this way of thinking or this moral? Then it doesn't matter whether it was conceived of 1,000 years ago or yesterday. Right, you have an objective reality, and Rand says that your morals are meant to help you adapt to that reality. So it can be scientifically probed in a way, tested, right? Does this thought, if you were to have two groups, one group has that thought, the other doesn't, does that thought promote that group's survival and advancement? And so in that way, if you apply that litmus test to philosophies, and I'm not saying that Rand's, all of hers hold up to that litmus test, but she creates a framework through which we can evaluate philosophies throughout time and space.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's something that a lot of philosophers, there's a lot of philosophers that lay out entire frameworks for their own ideas, but there's very few that leave behind systems that people can use for themselves. I mean, we've heard of different concepts that that have lasted throughout time. A great example would be Aristotle's systems of logics, the original concept of dialectics, even in more, well, not recent, but more recent history, we have concepts like Hume's guillotine with the Izzot divide being very clearly defined and laid out. There's a lot of those things that when people go through their philosophies or when these philosophers lay out all their ideas, it's usually just their ideas. But I like you had mentioned already, I really like one thing with Rand, whether you agree with the concept of objectivism or not, I like that she made a point of creating a system that other people can use. She didn't just lay out her view on how everything needs to be. She also added the system of how she reached these conclusions so that other people, through their own thought process or viewing their world in their little slice of space-time, as we mentioned there, have the ability to try to apply the same thinking. And that's something that I think a lot of philosophers in general, either in the past or anyone that comes next, should really make a focus. That should become the focus of being able to lay out a system so that regular people who are having conversations about these ideas, about these thoughts, have a framework for reaching conclusions. Speaking, though, of philosophers in the future and the like, her works were from, quite a few years ago. As we know, she's already passed on. Would you say there's any thinkers today or any philosophers today that would really fit the title of having picked up the mantle of Rand?
Oh boy. Well, I think Rand's interesting in a sense because many of her disciples or prodigies have not gone on to become like formal philosophers, if that even really is a job in the 21st century. But they're spread far and wide throughout very important sectors of politics and government and all over the place. You don't even realize it, right? We know that Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the House here in the U.S., was a avid reader of her works in his youth. Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chair, right? You see people popping up all over the place who had been influenced by her ideas when they were younger and have brought those to whatever sector or kind of executive position they're dealing with now. In terms of pure just philosophy, I'm kind of upset to almost have to mention the same name 15 times. I'm not trying to plug anyone, but I think I really do think that line of thinking of Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, that they have taken on the mantle of trying to use evolutionary principles, objective principles that Rand laid out to come up with morals and rules that people can live by that are adaptive to humanity as a whole, that use that and promoting a freedom. I think that's important because, like, for those of your listeners who haven't checked out our book yet, that's kind of, I lay out in the introduction that I wrote to the book why freedom is adaptive, why throughout many cases in history around the world, it was indeed individuals being able to pursue their own interests without the burden of some chief or executive or government, federalism, whatever, that allowed our species to reach where we are today. Mm-hmm. So trying to apply her principles to promote the value of freedom, of libertarianism, of democracy, that's really where her ideas can have a lasting impact.
Mm-hmm. I guess one last question I'll ask you here. We're coming up a little close to time here. One question I'll ask for you here. We already know about Atlas Shrugged. We already know about The Fountainhead. Like I mentioned with every philosopher on the show, if you get the opportunity to read those works, definitely make the time to try and do so. It's always better to hear these ideas directly from the source whenever possible. That said, though, those are the two most famous. What would be an important work of hers that you think people should become more familiar with that aren't the mainstream Rand works? So other than those two, what would be another, like if you had to select what the third thing that people should go to is that she's worked on, what do you think that would be?
You're right there that a lot of times with any kind, it's always the later works that capture the imagination, and people often don't like skim over the earlier works that can be equally valuable. I think I'll give you two answers, even though I know most people should give one. In terms of just a book that's an easy read, that's a lot more condensed relative to Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead, Anthem, one of her earlier books, it's only like 150 pages or something, but it's a good narrative. It's an interesting read, and it gives a sense of why, right, in a dystopian society, why selfishness and freedom and pursuit of happiness are so valuable. Now, if you're looking for a more didactic sort of just her explaining her theories without that narrative, she has a short book called The Virtue of Selfishness, where she just lays out this theory for egoism against altruism, as we put it. Not for, trying to exploit other people and take what is theirs, but rather for a system where everyone pursues solely their own interests. And in that sense, we each build off of each other and create the innovations and progress that has led society thus far.
No, definitely. I was aware of Anthem. I wasn't aware of that other book, so I'll have to add that to my reading list.
Yes. The Virtue of Selfishness, that is.
Yeah.
It's also only like 100 pages or something, so. In Rand speak, that is very short.
Yeah. I mean, you could kill someone with a copy of Fountainhead.
In more ways than one, yes.
Well, we're going to wrap everything up here. Adam, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining here. Is there anything that you'd like to mention before we close things out?
Well, thank you, Killian. And I think in a very Randian sense, by stroking my own ego and, spouting my nonsense for 30 minutes, pursuing my self-interest, I hope that I've helped contribute to the self-interest of other people listening. Right. If that makes sense.
No, makes perfect sense to me. So again, thank you very much for coming on. For everyone that's out there listening, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes before in the series of philosophers, do go back and take a look at them. We do have quite a few posted as of now. If you haven't gotten a copy of Igniting Liberty, do make sure to get one, because if I don't mention that a second time, I know that Adam is going to hit me. Moving along, though, you can listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow me directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.